Question: how do you design a city of 90 billion people? How do you make it so you don't feel lost inside this crucible of gothic statues and pox gas? That is the problem designers at Fatshark faced while developing Warhammer 40,000 Darktide. Because Tertium should be impossible to read. And yet, most of the time, you know exactly where to go. This video is about the visual tricks, structural decisions and level design principles that turn a chaos-infested hive city into something readable. Because in Tertium, you feel the city, but you play the level. To design a hive city, you first need to design a credible one. A city is not just a matter of aesthetics, it is just as well a matter of how people interact with it. Kevin A. Lynch, in his book The Image of the City, describes it as the sum of paths, edges, districts, nodes, and landmarks. To understand a city is to understand how the inhabitants live the place, and the everyday interactions they have with it. Now translate this concept onto a hive city, described by the Warhammer 40,000 lore to be words unto themselves, where, for the populace, concepts such as the ground and sky are completely alien. This is Tertium, a massive arcology that is home to billions of humans, where industry and religion merge into a gothic and inhuman blend, a reflection of the Imperium of Man. But for Tertium to work as a setting, it cannot be just a cool-looking gothic backdrop. It has to feel like a place that people actually use. As stated by lead level designer Joachim Zetterberg, doing justice to the Warhammer 40,000 aesthetics is of course paramount. And what would the citizen of Tertium have in a suitcase? What would they have in their desk drawers? What does a public bathroom look like? This human-centric approach, so often ignored in video games in favor of sheer gameplay, reminds a lot of Lynch's theory. Hub zones, manufactories, transit hubs, markets, elevators, ventilation systems, maintenance areas and water systems, all areas that seem to have a job. Tertium is not decorated. It is worn down and lived in by its populace. And now for the other key ingredient, chaos. A narrative breaking point that brings infection, decay, ideological contrast and all-out urban warfare. It was a complex topic to tackle since a city infested by Nurgle hasn't been depicted much in concept art, even more so if we are talking about an early stage of infection, since the premise of Darktide revolves around expendable soldiers sent to fight back the heretics before the corruption fully takes over. So the idea was to strike a balance and have design layers stacked onto each other, from a credible city to an imperial city, and finally to a corrupted one. This was the task at hand for Darktide designers. Incorporate a credible gameplay loop inside an impossible setting. If Tertium is too straightforward, it doesn't feel like 40k. If it's really chaotic, it becomes unplayable. So after nailing the look and feel, it was time for the most demanding task of all, making the impossible city playable. This is where the real design problem begins. Remember, Darktide is a horde shooter, so a chaotic setting must work alongside an already chaotic gameplay loop. At face value, it should be overwhelming, especially for new players. And yet, I almost never felt lost inside these quarters. And after a couple of hours of gameplay, I started to understand why. Darktide does not solve the problem with one single trick. It works on 3 different layers. First, it controls movement, then it shapes combat, and finally, it manipulates perception. You perceive Tertium as a massive urban organism, but what you actually play is a carefully controlled sequence of readable spaces. You feel the city. You play the level. The first layer is flow. Almost every Darktide mission starts with the strike team being dropped from a Valkyrie inside the playable area. From here, the group is usually forced to drop down from the starting position, marking the formal start of the mission. The route then leads the players through various sections, interconnected by checkpoints that serve to regroup, ease the pressure, and load the next area. On the surface, this feels like you're descending into a massive city, but structurally, the game is cutting the level into readable pieces. These points of no return often take the form of collapses, drops, broken bridges, and elevators. They turn navigation into an almost digestive process. Tertium swallows you up. And then Flight Lieutenant Mazosi pulls you out. And this concept merges function and theme. Functionally, the drop eliminates backtracking. Emotionally, it conveys a descent into the lower levels of the hive. The player does not need to constantly ask, should I go back? Did I miss the correct route? Is this the wrong direction? Because the level quietly removes those questions. The path may look buried under pipes, debris, and gothic machinery, but the actual decision space is much stricter than it seems. Darktide does not make the city simple, it makes the next step simple. The second layer is structure. Let's get back to what we call the mission sections. In a blog post on Darktide level design and cinematics, Fatshark describes them as chunks. A mission is typically composed of several chunks that vary in topology and gameplay approach. A maze, a street, an open plaza, or a narrow corridor alternate one another to give each playstyle a moment to shine in any given level. We can view these chunks as restricted battlefields that mirror the scale of a typical Warhammer 40k tabletop match. Far from an unheard of approach, but one that directly links pacing, scale, encounter design, and the Warhammer identity. The player perceives Tertium as an urban organism, but the gameplay takes place across a series of arenas, choke points, balconies, corridors, and holdout areas, seamlessly weaved together. And this matters even more because Darktide is not just Vermintide with guns. Compared to the latter, in the former, ranged and melee combat are more evenly split, with gunplay being a significant part of the experience. Many builds revolve around shooting, and this hybrid combat loop requires level to incorporate FPS staples like sightlines and cover. Level design must consider flanking routes for both players and enemies, as well as enough room to dodge and weave both blades and bullets. In addition, given the significant presence of ranged enemies, the level must also be visually clear in terms of depth. You need to understand where the fire is coming from, where enemies can move, where cover is, because encounters can become very chaotic very quickly. And the necessity to account for both ranged and melee at every given moment means shaping the architecture to encompass both playstyles. Topological contrast is the key to a good level design. Short and long, wide and narrow, high and low, but even navigation and combat are all contrasting elements that need to alternate to generate rhythm. Darktide alternates between compression and expansion. This is what prevents linearity from becoming monotony. You feel the city, but you play the level. The third layer is perception. How come all this architecture doesn't crumble down in an unreadable chaos of gothic statues and laser beams? There are usually two ways to guide the player inside the level, those being user interface like icons and waypoints, or diegetic elements, visual features that are incorporated into the map itself. The latter is harder to implement because it means making the level flow without adding an additional level of information. I'd even argue that, for Darktide, the UI design is the weakest of the two, with indicators that get often lost during the chaotic encounters. What is not weak is the use of natural and artificial light. Bright openings, lamps, fires, and industrial glows contrast heavily on the dim backdrop to guide the eye through dark environments. Then there are directional structures, painted markings on doors and corridors, pipelines and stairs that work almost as vanishing lines. And finally, every level has some sort of memorable landmark, be it a building, a collapsed train, a huge library, or a lone Lehman Russ tank. It may seem silly, but these eye-catching props are what stick in the player's mind long after the mission's over. And this becomes even more important because many of the levels make use of connective reuse of spaces. As you progress through the campaign, you realize that the missions take place within the same 6 broad environments. However, the path to the objective changes. So while the architectural silhouettes and landmarks of each environment remain recognizable, it still feels like you're tackling a new route to the same city. This connective reuse of spaces is a clever way to address the challenge of designing each of these environments from scratch. Places like the Carnival or the Hourglass require significant design effort, so Darktide simply could not have dozens of environments, at least not once this well crafted. But reuse also helps sell the illusion of a real city. You are not jumping between disconnected levels, you are crossing the same district from different angles. But if everything we've seen so far points to a linear experience, why then Tertium still feels huge? Because beyond the playable path keeps going. Floors above and below, corridors behind barriers, machinery in the distance, massive vertical shafts. It's true that every mission has a defined and controlled path, but if you look around, you'll notice that the city continues all around you. This is consistent with the concept of a hive city, built layer upon layer of plasteel and ferrocrete. And this brings us back to the crucial starting point, conveying the immense scale of Warhammer 40,000. Except that, in this case, scale is not just a matter of style. It serves to create a sense of vastness that masks what is, all things considered, a controlled and linear structure. This is the whole trick. You feel the city, but you play the level. A frequent critique aimed at Darktide is that while the environments are undeniably stunning and play smoothly, the quantity is limited and they quickly become repetitive. And it's a valid point. We are looking at roughly 20 missions distributed across a handful of locations. In a title centered on the grind for resources and equipment progression, players are forced into a loop of the same zones until every corner is etched into their memory. While varied builds and high-intensity modifiers can inject some freshness into the gameplay loop, the core issue remains. It is the price to pay for a high level of handcrafted detail. Take a title like Deep Rock Galactic, which operates on a comparable loop of missions, objectives, extraction, and repetition, but relies on procedural generation to make every descent feel distinct. DRG uses a hybrid system. Manually designed rooms and environments are connected through algorithm-generated tunnels and passageways. And yet, procedural generation can create unpredictable spaces, but it can also produce environments that are harder to navigate, less composed or repetitive in their own way. At the far end of the spectrum, we have No Man's Sky, where procedural systems generate entire planets from terrain and atmosphere to flora and fauna. The result is an almost impossible amount of scale. But without a human designer carefully shaping pacing, movement, contrast, landmarks, and emotional weight, a space can be infinite and still feel strangely uniform. Ultimately, this is the fundamental compromise of level design. Neither approach is automatically better. They solve different problems. Darktide chooses composition. It chooses readable paths, memorable landmarks, controlled encounters, a strong visual identity, and a level of environmental detail that would be extremely difficult to preserve across endless procedural variation. And that choice has a cost. The more you play, the more visible the structure becomes. The same carefully designed skeleton that keeps you oriented also reminds you that Tertium is not infinite. It is curated, but it is repeated and controlled. And that might be the most honest way to understand Darktide's level design. 90 billion people. That's how many the city was built to hold. You never see them. You never see most of Tertium at all. You feel the city, but you play the level. And somehow, that is exactly why it works. But please give us more levels. The Emperor protects.
If only the sewer-like souls of the heretics could be purified as easily as this water!